Oh, oh boy. Yeah. Hey! I didn't see you there. Just putting the Martini Carbine through a kind of a workout, you know. It's kind of new to the channel. Yeah, it's going along nicely. Say, I'm about to go do some grouping practice. You know, first time out kind of deal. You want to come along? Awesome, yeah. Okay, let's go. What's that? Oh, I know. Super cute. Carbine's not too bad either. As you might understand, the Martini-Henry Cavalry Carbine Interchangeable Mark I, to use its full name, is a relative newcomer to the channel. Now, this is not a comprehensive look at the arm itself, that will come later as part of the channel's Carbine series, but rather, this will serve as perhaps an insight into the process that every new arm is put through in order to achieve the best possible outcomes in shooting activities. This, of course, is balanced with the historical details of arm and ammunition. Powder is different, brass is different, sometimes bullets are different. So while on the surface, picking historical specifics such as powder charge might appear to be the only option, I have always taken a slightly more liberal approach, knowing necessary deviations may require somewhat ahistorical solutions. A modern powder may, for instance, need to be used in greater quantities to achieve the desired velocity, or, perhaps more importantly, the correct standard of accuracy. In the end, I am always guided by the historical, though not a slave to it, often because it's impossible to achieve in the first place due to the lack of accurate historical components. The Martini Cavalry Carbine was the successor to the service's first universally issued breech-loading cavalry carbine, the Snyder. That weapon had equipped the cavalry from the late 1860s. Following common practice, the Martini Cavalry Carbine entered service a few years after its infantry counterpart, and was adopted in 1877, with its first issue happening within the next couple of years. The 17th Lancers, for instance, fresh from turning in their pistols in 1876, were issued with the Martini and carried it during the regiment's service in South Africa during the Anglo-Zulu War of 1879. The Martini would equip the cavalry well into the late 1890s, when it was gradually replaced by the Lee Metford carbine. My Martini carbine is an example that saw service in South Australia. It would appear to be an earlier issue, as there is no provision for a rear sight protector, a feature that was later retrofitted. Colonial and Dominion weapons commonly feature this time capsule effect, as common improvements or modifications were not applied with the same degree of universality as in British Army service. You'll note there is no provision for a sling, as the carbine at this point was carried in a small bucket on the offside of the horse. The sights go up to an optimistic 1,000 yards using a simple ladder and slider. The muzzle features aspects that point to its cavalry pedigree. The front sight has protective wings, and the cleaning rod is housed in a fitting underneath the barrel that helps prevent it catching on leatherwork as it was withdrawn and replaced into the bucket. All in all, a very handy and lightweight arm. As for ammunition, this presented an opportunity for expanded experimentation. Coinciding with the adoption of the Martini carbine, it was decided that the round as used in the rifle was perhaps a bit too powerful for use with the carbine and its much lighter weight. Entering service as the cartridge, small arm, ball, carbine, breech-loading Martini-Henry Mark I, the cartridge featured a smaller, lighter bullet, and although this was of the same caliber, was shorter, and the powder charge was decreased accordingly, from 85 to 70 grains. The extra space inside the case was made up with a small amount of cotton wool. To indicate its different nature, the paper used to wrap the bullet was dyed red. Of course, moving towards the workup of this rifle, the goal was to try and replicate carbine ammunition in general. Thankfully, Martin from X-Ring Services stocks a mold casting a version of the historical bullet. The bullet is shorter at 1.02 inches and has a diameter of 0.457. Although the historical diameter was 0.451 and tapered, the X-ring version is parallel-sided and slightly wider, so that when patched, it comes close to the .469 or .70, which fills the nominal chamber dimensions of the carbine. Being parallel-sided makes it infinitely easier to patch. Although not required in the slightest, I did dye the paper for a few of the batches of ammunition I made for a little bit of historical likeness. The bullet as cast weighs in the neighborhood of 410 grains. So, with the choice of bullet set, there were a few variables to decide on. In addition to the bullet, there was the powder charge, the wad and grease cookie combination, and the overall length. As with all workups, it's important to isolate each variable as best as possible. And to that end, the powder charge would be the only variable adjusted for these practices. In order to achieve a reasonable comparison with the 70 grain service charge, I selected a range of 5 different charges, beginning at 62.5 and ending at 72.5 grains. Lubrication and taking up the extra space inside the case are mitigated by the use of wads, grease cookies, and a filler of some sort. Now, the full process of making this ammunition has been detailed in previous videos, but I used cotton wool filler and a beeswax grease lubricating wad. Although the historical lubricating wad was pure beeswax, I have found these to be somewhat less effective than a wad made out of a mixture of beeswax and grease. The filler is used as much for taking up the space in the case as it is to hold the powder in the case when the case is inverted to insert the grease cookie with the method I typically use. For my initial experiments, this was the combination I used. However, as we'll see later in the video, another round of practices saw the use of a different material as a filler. This entails the use of a small section of what is termed foam backer rod. This is used in construction to seal gaps in windows and door frames, and comes in various thicknesses. There are some advantages to using this product. It doesn't burn, unlike the cotton wool, which can be difficult to mitigate in hot, dry summer conditions. Also, it is quite economical. A bag of 20 feet, enough for hundreds of rounds, is only a few dollars. It is cut into 1-inch pieces and pushed into the case in place of the cotton wool. After this, the usual process of card wad, the grease cookie, and this aptly demonstrates the need of a filler inside the case for this particular method, followed by 2 more card wads are placed in the mouth of the case. With the powder charge selected, the filler and wads in place, this left the selection of the overall length left to do. To that end, for these sets of practices, I decided to pick a somewhat historical overall length of 2.98 inches. Without overtly dwelling on the subject, I must admit that there are few nicer looking rounds than a paper patched Martini cartridge. In this case, the red paper certainly dresses it up nicely. Thus, with the parameters set, and those initial experiments intending to look at the best powder charge only, it was time to start shooting. One element that I did decide to include was the blow tube. Featured many times before on the channel, the blow tube was a historical tool used for competition shooting only. By imparting warm, moist air down the barrel, the fouling is kept in a softer and thus less impactful state. With 3 or 4 breaths exhaled slowly between rounds, it also keeps the pace of shooting to a very calm and sustainable rate. I decided to start at the low end of the scale with the 62.5 grain load. Well, that's the very first group I've shot with the Martini carbine. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Lots more shooting left. This one, 62.5 grains of 2F. There's always some trepidation the first time you shoot any rifle. Greater accuracy notwithstanding, I was pleased with the result. Next up was the 65 grain load. Well, here we are, 65 grains of 2F. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. My initial assessment as I walked up to the target was that there was a modest improvement. Grouping number 3 added another 2.5 grains to the load, in this case 67.5. Perhaps this little clip here demonstrates why showing the full cycle of shooting a group is perhaps not the best as far as a YouTube video goes. It can be a very long process. And resultingly, I have, as you've seen in the previous groups, tried to use some creative editing to speed things up. These reduced carbine loads actually made shooting the rifle quite comfortable. Don't get me wrong, the little rifle thumps along nicely. Well, that was a bit unfortunate. Around round 7 or 8 there was definitely an undercharged round. That's obviously on me. That would be it. The remainder of the group, however, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and 9. One flyer. So, apart from the flyer, that's looking very good right there. The 8 rounds, forming the main part of the group, are what I would expect typically from a Martini rifle. But in true British muzzleloaders fashion, there's always one fly in the ointment. For reasons I can't explain, I had intended to incorporate a certain bit of kit in the practices. I must have got focused and forgot all about it until later in the day. This was the 1882 pattern bandolier for mounted infantry, though, as history will show, it became common kit for the cavalry as well. Holding 50 rounds in individual loops, covers were fixed every 10 rounds, with 2 5-round sections in the middle. This solution to carrying ready-use ammunition was much better than ammunition carried in pouches when mounted. It was famously used in many campaigns, including by the Camel Corps during the Sudan campaign of the mid-1880s, and in modified form, suiting the later .303 cartridge, it would be worn by the 21st Lancers during their famous charge at Omdurman in 1898. A fairly straightforward design, packaged ammunition was simply broken open, and the individual cartridges placed in the loops. Then, the flap was closed over the corresponding 10 or 5-round section, using the 2 brass studs and leather tabs fitted for that purpose. It was worn over the left shoulder, thereby angling the ammunition as to make it convenient to draw with the right hand. Grouping number 4 would see the process arriving at the service charge of 70 grains. Well, there we have it, the 70 grain effort. I think they're all there. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Yep. Well, as they say, a little vertical spread there, which is probably more to do with me than anything else. But yeah, things are moving along nicely. As you can see here, things look like they were starting to open up. The last grouping of this outing was number 5, shooting 72.5 grains of 2F. Well, that was 72 grains. 2 grains over the service charge. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. So they're all there. But as you can see, a little bit of vertical stringing in the group. Chances are that's my issue. Yeah, not bad in the center though. Despite the fact that I hadn't crunched any numbers yet, it was becoming obvious that there was a little bit of a curve forming in relation to the figures of merit and group sizes of the 5 groups shot. So that was the first outing done and dusted. 5 groups and some promising results. But what to make of it all? Viewers of the channel may be aware of my continued use of a method of measuring accuracy known as figure of merit. This is the mean radial deviation of a group by another name, and is perhaps more effective at gauging the capacity of any rifle and shooter combination. I do keep notes and collect necessary data as I shoot. This is then entered into the figure of merit calculator. For more information on this topic, there's a video in the channel's miscellaneous playlist entitled A Figure of Merit, measuring the accuracy of the Enfield muzzleloader. The figures of merit were as follows. The 62.5 grain load gave a figure of merit of 2.83 inches. The 65 grain, 2.59 inches. The 67.5 grain, 2.01 inches. The 70 grain, 1.99 inches, and the 72.5 grain, 2.41 inches. These numbers are then entered into another spreadsheet, and a graph is produced comparing the results. 99 times out of 100, successive groups using variations on one variable will graph on a curve, with a particular load showing the best results. In this case, it was the 70 grain load, with a minuscule edge over the 67.5 grain load. You will notice that the 70 grain load has a smaller figure of merit, but a larger group size when compared to that of the 67.5 grain. This is exactly why figure of merit is a better gauge of accuracy, as it measures how tight the group is on average, evening out the radical effects of flyers and such. Now, my process isn't quite so absolute as these 5 groups may indicate, and as successful as the first outing was, all it really did was identify where the attention was needed in subsequent shooting. I selected the 65, 67.5, and 70 grain loads for another round of practices. I understand that there's been a lot of shooting so far, and I've tried to abridge these 10-round groups, showing only 3 or so. So, 65 grains of 2F. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. I used a fine sight for this, and that probably explains why the grouping is a little bit on the low side. Grouping number 7 was 67.5 grains. Well, it looks like I shanked one here, off on the left. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. And that was 67.5 grains of 2F. Point to note, I did use a full sight for that particular practice, and as you can see, that raised the point of impact up from this area here up to here. The final grouping of the outing was back to the service charge of 70 grains. Well, sometimes the results that you're expecting or perhaps hoping for just don't seem to really materialize, and this is a good example of that. 2 rounds extra high here, which kind of offsets what would otherwise be a very reasonable group down here. They're all there. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Such as the trials and tribulations of a workup. With the second outing complete and another 30 X's and Y's to be added to the spreadsheet, these results, obviously influenced by the fact that I hadn't paid some sort of homage to the gods who govern black powder shooting, indicate a somewhat lackluster performance when compared with the same loads shot in the first outing. The figures of merit of the second 3 groups weren't as good as those with the same loads in the initial outing, and resultantly the graph, averaging the results from all common loads, is much more of a straight line. Such are the tribulations of mathematical representations of hugely variable and subjective activities, I suppose. And it might have something to do with the fact that these second groupings were shot with bullets patched with red paper instead of white, but more than likely because I used foam backer rod instead of cotton wool. I'm sorry. Over time, I'll revisit these loads and shoot some more rounds. With the data collected there, the process, and the results as shown on this graph will continue to evolve. For all your Snyder or Martini-Henry reloading needs, talk to Martin at X-Ring Services. For those viewers so inclined, the Cody Firearms Museum at the Buffalo Bill Center of the West is launching a Kickstarter campaign to reprint in full the complete issue of the ARMAX Journal of Contemporary Arms. There will be a number of tiers available to support the project, which will include various options in binding and presentation. If you're interested, check out the project at the link in the description. The campaign goes live on the 22nd of May, 2023. If you'd like to support the channel, please stop by our Patreon page. The link is in the description below. For more information on projects and updates between videos, follow us on our Facebook page. What was once Utreon is now Player. It still remains a good alternative to YouTube and Patreon, as those platforms have become rather troublesome for content as found on this channel. May I suggest following British muzzleloaders there as well. The effect of 50 muzzle blasts.